Welcome, everyone, to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent and Leadership Podcast.
Hey,
You're there.
I'm here. How are you doing?
I'm well.
I'm glad to hear it. That's good.
Yeah. So let's get started with this week. Ron Taylor is our guest, and he works with EOS, Equal Opportunity Schools. One of the things that I've always liked about EOS is the process for identifying children to be in honors, AP, CTE courses, higher level coursework. My struggle initially, particularly when we started, was the ability to support kids who essentially took a leap of faith to join classes. Let me just stop there. What have your experiences been with EOS?
Literally, it's been my primary approach when I'm supporting been in districts to support them around EOS. The Equity Collaborative has always been hired behind EOS because they're like, well, our teachers are really struggling.
Right. Hey, you got the intelligence to take an AP course. And then the teacher's like, well, I mean, we should have prerequisites because this kid can't write.
This was the other thing that I thought
on kids.
Was interesting about him and was just generally about EOS and not EOS, more specifically like the concept of honors courses. Like what gets us to what makes it honors? What makes it
that fascinating? So our high schools, when I became superintendent, had decided that they were going to dismantle the honors classes. And so they decided, look, you want to take an honors class? Because what they did was they evaluated the honors and non-honors class and everything was the same. And so if you want to take this as an honors class, you can contract for honors. Hey, look, it's the same class. They take the same test at the end of the year. There's no difference. I want to talk about his use. He talked about data. And I feel like I coined a phrase that I had written down. So I have to believe I created this phrase. And I'm going to put it in my next book, which is active negative data. Active negative data is the idea that we are persistently looking for what isn't working. It's the opposite of appreciative inquiry. It is what schools fall victim to of this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work. And so it is the quick solution to fix what is not working. It's active and that's persistent. It's this sort of negative cycle that one falls in, and it is mining just the data that reveals what isn't working as opposed to looking for what you and I have talked about from the very beginning, that appreciative lens of what's working and how do we get more of it.
Isn't it interesting that, such a fascinating, I love that. Good job. Write about that. That'd be fun. But that's actually what you have to do. As a coach, my job is to help you get better at a thing that you want to get better at, that you're not so good at. Like I really don't think I just was coaching someone and wanted to get better at handling a basic management meeting where there's conflict between the manager and the employees, one employee in particular. And just wanted help getting ready to lead that meeting in a way that felt productive to both people. But that was basically indicating to me that they weren't ready to lead that meeting. They felt nervous about conflict. They felt nervous about saying to the manager, your behavior is inappropriate here. That's what it is.
I can imagine.
If you only focus on negative data, you only become about negative data over and over and over and over.
So it's almost like those two people that you just described. Where have their positive interactions been? What did they look like? How did that feel? What did you feel in that moment? How do we get more of that?
See, that's such a great, both of those are better coaching questions than I asked. I think my coachee is very ready for the conversation and will do quite well. But those are great coaching questions because then you're setting up the management and employees to try and replicate positive.
So I want to know, how are you using data in your own coaching work with the Equity Collaborative?
That is a question that we are constantly asking ourselves and trying to improve because our work is leadership development, self-driven leadership development. We are supporting a principal to be a better principal based on the goals that they've identified for themselves. Sometimes those goals are from the superintendent, but usually they have their own goals about what they want to try to get better at. We do two things. We collect survey data, and people that take the time to fill out the piece is really helpful. And then the second data collection tool that we use we would like to use, is more qualitative in nature, in that like instead of Jamie, if I'm your coach, Peter, one of my colleagues would run a quick interview with you to hear like, how did it go?
Yeah, I love that as a conversation as opposed to just a Google survey or form that you fill out. Yeah. That to me is so meaningful. I ask it because the work that you do, that the Equity Collaborative does, is really around identifying one's mindset. You have probably not done this work before. Let's kind of figure out your experiences, how you were socialized and how you see the world. And so that's important. And then to begin helping them shift to maybe see where they have possibly fallen short in a system where they have excelled. And so sometimes that takes a long time. So if your data, if I'm asking you, hey, what kind of data do you look at? And if you were to tell me, well, we'd like to see achievement data increase. We'd like to see end of the year test scores, attendance improve. I'm thinking to myself, I don't know how you would tie your work to that in the short term. That is like, we've been working with this district for 10 years and have seen these amazing things happen because they were able to retain great people who did that important self-work that then stitched itself into the classroom with kids and community.
Have you seen that? There was a Harvard research study. You've heard of the phrase that, like any major change within our system, within a public system, 3 to 5 years for it from take up to implementation.
Yeah, I've heard 3 to 5. I also heard 5 to 7 because it was sort of aligned to second language acquisition. It is to say, you think kids are going to all of a sudden, be bilingual? No, it's a 5 to 7 year process.
Exactly. So Harvard did a study on social change, meaning we'll use the EOS as an example, but that takes there are a lot of levers there, right? There are parents that don't agree. There are kids that are not prepared. There are teachers that are not prepared. What do we mean by honors? What's the curriculum? The research showed that kind of change, 10 years. What is the tenure of any teacher?
Let's talk about superintendent who's leading that work and allocating the budget and convincing the board.
How long does the superintendent stay on?
Exactly. 3 years.
All right. We don't have a long enough tenure often of anyone, leader particularly, superintendent particularly, to hold true to a 10-year process. That's a long time.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I'm asking you about data, and there's a reason, I think, because, well, first of all, you just asked about how do we define honors. And so it's almost like sometimes we're collecting data and we just want to make sure we're collecting it for the right reasons, or we even know what we're collecting and why and how it's going to guide our next practices and things like that. So anyway, I do want to get going with our conversation with Ron. Is there anything else you want us to think about before we listen to the conversation?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it was almost an offhand comment that you made about honors courses when you said honor CTE courses. And this is what I don't think people really consider related to schooling, is that the reason why you keep hiring people to fix your house is because you don't have anything to teach you how to build a deck. And that is the fact that Princeton doesn't have a course on HVAC. Well, that's actually Princeton's fault.
Do you remember taking what was called, now it's called Family and Consumer Science, FACS, but it was called home ec back then?
Yeah. Yes, I took home ec.
Me too. And I can sew because of that. I can, I understand the principles of cooking because of that. Yeah. I remember Lorette Marr. We were making peanut butter cookies that we would sell to the other class that was sewing, because every few weeks you'd change. And Lorette put in 3 tablespoons of salt instead of 3 teaspoons. And nobody bought our peanut butter cookie. People were like, oh, that's
It's so good. It's so good. That's such a standard kid. That's a good story.
So how about this? Let's listen to our conversation, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about all the great things from this conversation. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Imperfect leaders. Are you facing challenges filling open speech-language pathologist positions within your district? Kind of a silly question, because I know you are. MPAT Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with MPAT Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. MPAT Speech, EMPAT Speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools. Today on An Imperfect Leader, my guest is Ronald Taylor, a former superintendent in residence for the Equal Opportunity Schools organization, EOS, and the author of The Courage to Lead with Integrity for Equity. Ron, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you so much for welcoming me. I'm excited to chat.
I am really excited to welcome you to An Imperfect Leader. And I wonder if we could start with EOS, because the mission of EOS is to help underserved and underrepresented students have equitable access to challenging high school courses. And so can you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing? How can schools do that? And how have you worked to do that as a school leader?
Sure. Thank you. So I recently joined EOS. We had a great partnership in my former school district. I couldn't find anyone else who specialized in this type of complex work. You need support when you're trying to have a huge paradigm shift, such as trying to make your most rigorous courses more diverse. And so for me, it's understanding, I was a superintendent for 13 years between two different school districts. And when you're talking about school districts with thousands of kids, as a leader, you must first come to grips with that this is a pursuit worthwhile of your priority. So how can you, as a leader, convince yourself that before we take on this giant task, do we have the need for it? Not every district is the same. Not every school is the same. It starts with the data. You have to look at your data to determine that there is an issue that needs to be addressed. Schools are large, complex organizations. Every superintendent, every principal has a million things to do. You have to create the urgency, in my opinion, by identifying the data connected to whatever the issue or challenge is. After you've been able to do that, you've been able to look at the data and connect that data to the challenge. It might not be an academic challenge. It may be a challenge on your state report that says, hey, your enrollment in these courses does not reflect your general demographics or that of the school. After you do that, you then can make it a formal goal. To me, formal goal setting is just such a lever for leaders to make change. The formal goal means it's a goal for yourself that you're making with the Board of Education. You're officially, formally voting on the record to address a challenge. Once it becomes your goal as the leader, it's your job to cascade this goal across your organization and make it a formal goal to be evaluated from other leaders. And you have to share the data. You can't just find the data, share it with your board, and then create the goal. To make it formal and to get buy-in from your students, your staff, your principals, et cetera, you have to share that data with them formally through presentations, show your commitment. Through my research, EOS was the only group that was showing success with this very complex goal. Last but not least, one of the most important pieces is you have to invest in it. You have to not just invest your money, but your time and your commitment. You have to check in with those folks who have responsibilities.
This morning, I took a walk with somebody who is from Shaker Heights, Ohio. It couldn't have been more obvious that the universe knew that I was going to talk to you today, and they were going to tell me, oh, we're going to put in your path this individual from Shaker Heights, Ohio. And I said, are you familiar with John Ogbu's work? The person was like, no, because I'm not an educator. And I said, well, in the 1990s, so about 30 years ago, John Ogbu did work on Shaker Heights. And Ogbu says, look, here's a community of means. And isn't it curious that African-American kids have done worse than their white peers, even though their economic status is equal? And so if you were to control for all of that, we're still seeing within our systems inequities and underperformance. And so EOS says, look, you have brilliance in your school district. You have brilliant minds who are absolutely eligible and should be enrolled in higher level courses. And the system has put up obstacles or not done what it needed to do. And so I love the process of identifying kids, identifying champions, and finding ways to make sure that children have access to honors and AP courses and higher level CTE courses, those higher level courses all across the board. One of the things that I saw when we were implementing EOS within our own school district was it's one thing to identify and encourage and even convince a kid to take higher level courses. The second part is, how do you support? And I think that's what you're saying at the end there about how do you make sure that there is support not only for individuals who are now teaching students that they may not have had the opportunity to teach in the past because of the way the system was set up, as well as for children who are now have been encouraged to take classes that they haven't always been told that they would be successful in. And so I'm curious, does that resonate? How does that, what does that make you think about?
It does. I think so. Shaker Heights, I'm very familiar. They often refer to my former district, South Orange and Maplewood, New Jersey, and Shaker Heights as sister districts. I know the former superintendent there. We've had lots of conversations about their journey, lots of similarities in demographics, et cetera. For me, I think that part of what makes EOS special and their engagement special is the planning year. Having that year that we're not shotgun starting this thoughtful, important work the first day of school when teachers haven't had a chance to really learn about it and authentically believe in it. Where guidance counselors haven't had a chance to really add their intimate knowledge of kids to this work. I think it's just so important that if you want it to last and you want to stand the test of criticism and questioning from folks who just are seeing something very different than what they're used to, that planning year is just so important, because the EOF lead who comes in to work with the principal and the guidance counselors and the teachers and even meet with the students about the opportunity, having that time to really build that relationship, organization to organization, and it allows the superintendents to give timely updates to the Board of Education and the public about what we're doing, and being able to show the resources and the connections is just so important. There's no shortcut for the time that takes. This is not just a fly-by-the-night program or partnership. This is real authentic work that has impact on children for the rest of their lives.
You're really speaking to the fact that when you agitate for change, the system will work aggressively to get back to status quo. It likes status quo. And so I really appreciate what you are urging leaders to do, which is to say, look, this work is important. We didn't just get here today. We didn't just get here yesterday. It's been in place for a long time, this system. And if we're going to agitate for meaningful change, we're going to have to take meaningful steps. And so we're going to take a year to consider everything from, why are we doing this? What does our data say? What are our own bias? The worst thing we can do is get bias confirmation about children being in courses and then saying, look, they can't be successful. Why did we even do this, right? I imagine your book speaks to this as well. Tell us all about your book.
Yeah, so thanks for this opportunity. After 28 years in public education, I recently retired, and I just felt like my journey was unique. And throughout my own readings, I really couldn't find anything that reflected what my journey was. I often mentor folks who are on a similar path as me, and I also do executive coaching for up-and-coming administrators who are looking for the route to a successful superintendency. I thought that, I really want to put this into a written form so that it can far past my own personal reach. It really shows my journey through the lens of school and educational equity as a student, teacher, administrator, and superintendent, and a researcher. And the thread there that how my life, and many folks who have lived similar lives to me, how we've seen that invisible thread of school equity follow us. And whether it be as a student, how do you get from middle school to high school where I lived? Whether it be a school choice model, how did that impact me personally? And also being a teacher who, even from your very first days of being selected as a teacher in a school, how did I get selected? I often tell the story about, at the time, I had a girlfriend who was also an aspiring teacher, and I was hired way before her, but she had better grades than me. She had a master's degree from Harvard, and I did not have an advanced degree, but I was hired first. And when we talked about that, and she told me, she said, a Black male in elementary school is gold. People are going to always snap you up first, regardless of almost my quality, right? Or my abilities, which was the first time I really remembered where inequities benefited me. Having to have that lens of understanding your own privilege. And so just following those threads and being able to reflect on them, even in the form of school leadership, where I was a principal and an assistant principal in Washington, D.C., and understanding how that thread followed me through those places of leadership and how I was able to build a great team. And through a diverse team of just brilliant people, we were able to have fantastic results for our kids, all the way to the superintendency, where I had to sit in really tough conversations about where do we invest our funds? How do we convince people that having diversified spaces, like we're talking about with EOS and advanced placement, why is it a worthwhile investment, not only with our funds, but also with our emotional intelligence and our real commitment to the community, and knowing that sometimes the folks who you're really fighting for to address those inequities are silent. They don't come to the board meetings. They don't have loud voices. They don't use email to advocate for themselves. And so all those different pieces I've just found to be really impactful. And I really worked on reviewing the impact of school facilities on student achievement. And I was able to find a really strong correlation, that there is a correlation between the quality of school facilities and academic gains, and also attendance for kids. And so then in my career, I was able to support teams building almost $200 million worth of construction, right? So in those conversations, again, bringing in that school equity thread when we're making such large generational decisions.
I'm really excited to read your book. That sounds great. If you're just joining us, our guest today is former Superintendent Dr. Ronald Taylor. I believe really strongly in human-centered leadership, and I get a sense that is important to you as well. You just mentioned about building important teams, essential teams, because not any one of us can do it alone. And there's a dimension in the model called leaders learning work. It's a key component of leaders learning work is systems thinking and system design. Let me give you an example of how that might look. I recently attended the National Summit on Education hosted by Excel and Ed, and I usually associate Excel and Ed with promoting policies like school choice, vouchers, privatization. Let me just be on the record of saying I don't support the creation of competing systems of public education. Their position on enrollment in math courses, though, was something I felt very good about, and it appears to be aligned with the work that you've just been describing. As a default, they advocate for kids to be placed into higher level courses instead of relying on a parent or a teacher or somebody to intervene. And that adjustment, they believe, that one leverage piece will increase the number of students pursuing math and science careers after they graduate high school. And so I want you to put your leadership lens around equity and integrity, your more recent lens of EOS. What might be some things that school districts should be thinking about when it comes to supporting students in schools, particularly around pursuing this kind of policy of engaging them in more rigorous coursework?
So folks who know me well throughout my career, I am a self-admitted data geek, a data nerd. Data, you can have too much of it. And so for me, a school district or a school who was considering, this really innovative thought of policy shift, I think you have to first understand your population. Is there a demographical advancement gap, whether it be SES or race or the area of town that folks live in? And if so, does this achievement gap also connect to the enrollment in the course levels that we're discussing? I'm a real believer in the risk ratio analysis, where you can determine if there is a verified likelihood of actions or results that can be connected directly to a student's attributes. I think when you have that type of sophisticated analysis, it really helps to remove the emotion from these conversations that can sometimes come when folks think that you're just telling us what you think or telling us your moral belief. When you can show folks these connections, black and white on the board, verified by third parties, be able to show that there is an achievement gap here that we have verified that connects to our kids that are leaving our school district. I believe that also adding the stakeholder voice is critical in this kind of policy work. We know as superintendents that many times policies are automatic, right? The law changes, the policy changes, you have a committee meeting, that then the board votes for it. These type of innovative policy shifts, it really helps to have stakeholder voice involved.
Can I ask you, what do you mean by risk ratio analysis in this sense?
Sure. So risk ratio it's a mathematical equation, basically, where you do the analysis of the number of folks who are in the whole group and the number of folks who are in the subgroup that you're talking about, and whatever that other component is that you're trying to measure. And you can show, similar to baseball, the batting average, right? How likely is this group of people, how likely are they to be successful? Is it 5 out of 10, 2 out of 10, 1 out of 10? What's the percentage of success and likelihood of success?
I've never heard it in terms of success. I love it because I've always heard it in terms of failure or in terms of risk, the likelihood that something bad is going to happen. And in this case, you're talking about the likelihood that opportunities will be available or that, and that there's a need for it. And so I'm thinking to myself, school districts will say they offer 8th grade algebra. However, it's a 0-period class that you have to provide your own transportation. And so in this case, a district could say, we offer algebra in 8th grade. And is it possible to say that a risk ratio analysis would say, sure. However, when we look at all the attributes of kids who would be eligible to take this class but are not taking this class, that we find ourselves with an inequitable system.
Yeah, so I won't take credit for this. Dr. Eddie Fergus, he was in Temple, now he's a professor at Rutgers, and he shared this with us years ago, just talking about, again, who is likely, and you could have a negative lens to say who's likely to fail, or you can say who's going to be successful. Same numbers, just inverse, right?
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. I just always thought of it from like a risk management kind of thing, and you're taking it to this instructional curriculum piece in terms of opportunity. I think it's brilliant.
Thank you. And Dr. Fergus, we had many conversations about risk ratio. And it's also sometimes an uncomfortable opportunity for districts to be accountable to themselves, right? Where we can say, hey, we're a high achieving school district. We have a 94% graduation rate. It grew from 87%. Well, risk ratio can tell you, when you look at each of those folks who have demographics, maybe it's students who are of mixed race, maybe it's kids who are Black, maybe it's Latino. Are they likely to be in the 94% or the 6%? And so if you look at the entire group, it's always fantastic to have good news to share with the community that our kids are doing great. But when you're being honest with yourself and you're looking at this from an equity lens, risk ratio really helps you to determine how likely is each group to be successful. Sometimes we found that the program could have a design and an intent that is just very positive, but it's having a negative impact on the kids it's trying to help, right? And it could be a hard conversation, but when you have these numbers, again, back to the data, being able to really ground the conversation in the facts, it really helps to move it forward. And then when it's time for us to make tough decisions and votes, the vote becomes clear. You're not voting for Dr. Taylor's pet idea. You're voting on whether you're going to support kids who have a greater need than perhaps other kids in the population. And so you're balancing out your spending, and we can bring back the data afterwards to show the success or the continued challenges too.
Yeah, that's an important part, is coming back and then sharing. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Oh, wow. None of us are perfect as humans, right? That's part of what makes us human. We make decisions based on the information that we have. We sometimes make decisions based on the emotions that we're experiencing. We make decisions based on our loved ones and what we view as their needs. It's every person on this planet understands the word perfect and imperfect in their own way. But I think for a school leader, it's a little bit different. Research tells us how many decisions educators make every day, whether they are teachers or assistant principals, guidance counselors, principals and assistant supes, or even superintendents, of course. Every day we're struggling with decisions, and they could be very high stakes decisions or emergencies that have to be addressed or long-term planning. So I would say that most educators would be able to talk about very clearly their imperfections when it comes to choices or decisions that they had to make and things that they may change if they had another opportunity to do so.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being, and I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. Our guest today is former superintendent, author, a superintendent in residence for EOS, Dr. Ron Taylor. Now, in this segment, what we do is we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they made, and then we discuss it. So, Ron, what happened?
So many, right? So many. This was the 28th year of my life in public education and 13 years as a superintendent and I think 22 as an administrator in general. And so when given this thoughtful question about after action deconstructing, right? So I chose COVID, as I'm sure many of your guests might do, the unprecedented time. For context, I was a superintendent in South New Jersey in Willingboro for 8 years, and I took the opportunity to become a superintendent in South Orange Maplewood in North New Jersey in July of 2019. So if you're backwards mapping that, March 2020 was our COVID shutdown, right? And so it was a very challenging district, which attracted me. In the book I just completed, I had to have some self-reflection that almost every job that I've taken, I was attracted by the challenges there. And so this district it's a famous district, right? It had lots of stars that have come out of that district. There's an arts program, Lauryn Hill, the new sensation SZA, and other folks. But the district had some significant challenges. A $167 million construction referendum had been adopted, but had not been designed to be implemented. The board that hired me really wanted to integrate their schools. I know it's hard for some folks to believe in 2024 that school integration is still happening, but it is still happening. There are schools in that district that were drastically different from one another demographically. And it was a goal of the board that hired me to thoughtfully integrate their schools. And so the initial launch before I arrived, the thought was our construction and our integration can work together. We build more space, upgrade our space, and then we'll have time and space to integrate students. And I found that to be unnecessary after I did my research in the district and my collection of data, designing our III, which we call the Intentional Integration Initiative. And so in the beginning of all this, 2019 was going very well. We started our work by holding a symposium around the topic of school integration. To my surprise, over 1,000 people came out to that symposium, standing room only, and they all came to hear the new integration plan. And we surprised some by sharing that we're not here to release an integration plan. No way that I would have a plan to be released without input and without chances for conversation. This is generational work. So it was very well received, brought in professors on the topic and folks who could share from their lens of either legal or historical school integration. And so we had follow-up meetings, and then we found out, as the rest of the world did, that by our third integration community meeting, there was a 2-week shutdown coming for COVID-19. And literally, that was the email that superintendents received here in New Jersey in March of 2020, as the panic began to spread all around us and within us, that for 2 weeks we would be closed down and to try and prepare for kids to take home that was based on the state curriculum and our own curriculum, et cetera. Needless to say, after those 2 weeks, it was extended and everyone began to feel that we were going to be in a space that we had never been before. To our credit and our team's credit, we didn't stop the work of integration and construction. We did our first online only symposium, got more than 5,000 views on that. We were able to get feedback from those pieces that allowed us to design a pilot for the district to take on. Literally, we stood in the beginning and some of the worst parts of COVID, probably 20 miles from New York City, which was the epicenter. And we're still moving forward with this generational work. And many folks internally assume we will pause all of that, right? Going to pause that because we're in COVID. And I talk in my book about the equity thread. And the equity thread, of course, followed us through COVID because the district, even though it's very diverse and some students and some of our schools had one-to-one adoption of devices, many did not. And many also did not have the platforms necessary for online instruction that we're all very familiar with now, Google Classroom, Zoom, and all those things. And so we kept our instruction centered on access for all students. We knew it would be unfair for some students to have a significantly different or improved instruction from others. So we tried to improve everyone at the same pace. And we found that most folks were engaging and they understood. When we came back to school after the 20 school year, so we're talking about now in September, the state of New Jersey initially wanted every school and every district to reopen. And of course, that was met with huge resistance from parents and staff members. And so the state agreed that if you had improvements that you needed to do to your schools to reopen, then that was a reason that you could stay virtual until those improvements were completed. And for us, that was great, right? Because we did have improvements. We spoke about our construction needs, et cetera. And so we then moved forward with improving the virtual instruction model. We received lots of praise from families and from the board and community members and stakeholders that we really were thoughtful in not only improving the instructional model and we also distributed thousands of devices and hotspots like many districts did. And we got to the point where it was time to try and do all we could do to make the district and the buildings as safe as possible for return. And so this is where my decision comes into play here. My business administrator, which is the person in New Jersey who is in charge of the operational portions of school districts. They're in charge of the facilities and all the bills and the budgets, informed me that our buildings were ready. And so during this time, we were really close partners with our teachers union and other stakeholders. So we took walkthroughs through our buildings. We were so excited to get kids back in buildings. This is probably early October. And everyone walked through. The buildings are just spotless and they're beautiful. They hadn't been occupied in, 5 months, 6 months at that time. And everyone was very pleased with the multiple buildings. We went to one building and the Univent cover, which is part of, for those who may not know, a Univent is a piece of machinery that ventilates and heats and sometimes cools classrooms. And the Univent cover was not on. And so we could see inside of it, and to the shock of everyone who was with us, it looked horrible. The inside was very rusty. It had lots of debris in it. It looked like it had not been serviced. And so, of course, committed to investigating this further. And when I went back to my business administrator, who was wonderful, he had notes from our lead custodian at the time for our district that this work had been done. Further investigation, we found that was not true, that the Univents throughout the district many were not operational and many were not improved per our previous conversations and verifications and certifications from people from this department. And it was just terrifying as a leader because part of what my commitment is that we're going to always do what we say we're going to do. If we can't do it, we'll tell you that we can't do it, but we're never going to be dishonest But we had recently announced our reopening, and we were so proud to show off our buildings and all the work that had been done. But at this point, I did not have reliable information. I was talking with someone who said that something had been done, and it honestly had not been done. There's a couple things you can do at that point as a leader. You could be honest, right? And tell the community and tell the stakeholders that a mistake has happened. And as the leader, you take full responsibility for it. Or you can try to put it under the rug and try to do a quick fix and try to keep egg off of your face. And for me, after our business manager and I really got down to the brass tacks of what's happening, we found dishonesty that wasn't necessary. $167 million in construction had been approved because everyone knows that the schools were in really bad shape. One of the biggest fixes in that referendum were the ventilations and HVACs, things like that. They needed a lot of work. I wrote a personal letter to the community, being very honest about what happened and what I experienced, and that I take responsibility for it. But I'm also going to say that this dishonesty also occurred, because it did, and that we're going to take aggressive action. And as you can imagine, people were in uproar. But I also received so many thankful emails from the community saying, thank you for being honest with us. We know this was hard. And I just was overrun with that. But the decision that I would have made differently in that space is I would have personally visited those unit ventilators before I wrote that we're ready to roll. We were in a space of COVID where we were all separate, right? Even the offices were still virtual. So I was relying on people who I didn't know that long. And I was trusting just who would save if they had done the work and the work hadn't been done. And so to gain the trust of the community, I flooded them with pictures and updates with me and my business guy in the univents, looking at them, looking at the work and showing all this stuff. And part of it was also acknowledging that this work is supposed to happen over the next 4 years. We're not going to be able to replace all these unit ventilators. So we purchased air filters for every classroom, multiple, right? And that was really helpful in regaining trust. And it cost a whole bunch of money, of course. But if I had to do it over again, that's the change that I would make. During that time where we're just redesigning the way the schools work, I was inundated with the academic side of that, and also the operational engagement necessary and the distribution of devices. We were still serving lunch. So we had lunch outside for all the kids.
Right.
And so I didn't put focus on those HVAC pieces personally, because there were folks who knew a lot more than me in charge of it. But it was that important that I should have spent more attention to it if I could do it all over again.
You have walked through the questions I typically will interrupt and say, so what got overlooked? In this case, what got overlooked was these unit ventilators, and you had an expectation that they were going to be cleaned or replaced, and they weren't. What frustrated you? Clearly, you have shared what was frustrating, and you were very honest about what you could have done differently. Although I will also say, and any superintendent who's listening will say, there was so much to attend to during the pandemic. And the fact that you focused on how to continue to engage kids in their learning while trusting that the operations side was going to be done was a reasonable decision that you made. And to then say to yourself, I wish I had spent more time understanding these ventilation units and meeting with the team to ask for visual proof that the things have been done is appropriate. I'm curious what you learned about relationships. I think that is a huge one for any one of us throughout the pandemic, that we learned a lot about relationships. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind exploring that for 1 minute.
Sure. So I think that I had earned from the community grace during this time. They knew I hadn't been there long enough to, not even a full school year in person, to even evaluate my staffs, right? And so I think we earned lots of grace because of our approach to the integration piece and our commitment to it, that I was taking on a problem that had existed for 30 years and had not been significantly impacted. And even showing the commitment to push through that, even while we were in the emergency of COVID, I think that earned grace. And I also think that the letter I wrote, being as honest as possible, was a new thing for that district, right? When there was a real crisis happening, that earned from some folks a lot of grace. And I think that relationships also come in the trust internally, where in the communication between that person who was the lead facilities person and my business leader who was that person's direct report, that's 3 layers under me. And so you're assuming that those 2 people have a relationship where there's clarity, right? That if you didn't do this, if you didn't understand what was asked or anything like that, that you would say, hey, this is not going to happen, or it's not feasible, or there's no folks available to do this. We're in the pandemic, and that person would have taken that feedback as authentic and passed it up the chain in the middle of just, again, an unseen, unparalleled, unprecedented emergency for all of us, personally and professionally. But I think the relationships there, so I would say I had a good relationship with these people, and I assumed that they had that with one another. But I think when the pressure is turned up to such a high decimal, people make mistakes in judgment.
I imagine also your relationship with your teachers union was strengthened even more because you walked through together, noticed something together, and made the decision that you were going to pause and have to make a very difficult decision to alert your community that we weren't in fact ready, and that they saw when other decisions needed to be made that you were trustworthy. So collective bargaining is a huge piece for superintendents. And if you don't have the trust of your teachers union, they will default to, what are you hiding or what are you not telling us? And in this case, I imagine that you were able to demonstrate that you had their backs and that you were going to continue to negotiate in incredible faith for what you're able to do for teachers while maintaining the financial health of your school district.
Yeah, it goes in ebbs and flows, right? I remember that there was a lot of thanks from them in what I found and what we did. But this part of the country, I worked in different places, but this part of New Jersey, especially North Jersey, they're really old schools. Right? There are some newer additions. But for the most part, these are 100-year-old buildings. And so we weren't the only ones who said, hey, we're not going to be able to meet this standard. And so they appreciated that I was honest. And I think they appreciated because, just being honest, they wouldn't have wanted to come back, right? Like, that's also part of this, is they appreciated that. But it goes in ebbs and flows because there were other spaces after that, even on similar topics, that we didn't have a great relationship because of that time and that space and just the mental health that we were all suffering from with the pandemic. And part of what we saw after that was when we did come back in a hybrid type of mode, there were so many teachers who were so happy to be back and around one another. But there was some that was just terrified and not happy to be back, and then trying to manage the in-person kids.
Oh, I lived that. And then we had to say, stop hugging each other, because all of a sudden we'd get an entire grade level of COVID spread because people were so excited to see each other. So God. I guess I tried to wrap it up in a nice little bow to say, like, and wasn't this wonderful? You had the trust of your teachers, and you say, yeah, I would say that that was a good example of how we built trust together. And then there are other decisions that are made that you're constantly working on your relationship, particularly if before you, there may not have been great trust. You can't just immediately establish it.
Yeah. And again, being honest with you, right? With you and your listeners, that great decisions and great spaces and honesty and all those things can be great. And the goodwill can last a few weeks until something else happens, right? Because these things, we are in the people business, and people get upset by things that you didn't even know happened. Yeah. And
they did what? I didn't know about that.
And part of my book around, I was so intentional with the word courage, right? Because this work, courage is underrated in this work. Like, you have to stand up and say things that you know are the right thing to say that people are not going to like. And you have to have the courage to stand there and be able to deliver that message without blaming anyone else. And it's hard. And so writing that letter was probably one of the hardest things I did in my career, but it was one of the most lauded as well. So courage speaks for itself along with integrity.
Our guest today was former Superintendent Dr. Ronald Taylor. And I like how you ended with talking about courage. Throughout the entire conversation, I would have said the theme was integrity, whether it's your book, whether it's the III for your district, whether it's about access to classes and courses for kids or technology and food during the pandemic, whether it's about integrity when it comes to were we really ready to return because of the air events. You said we are always going to do what we said we were going to do.
Yeah.
And I think integrity is truly the way that I have taken this conversation away and that I hope to bring to others. So thank you so much for giving us your time today, your treasure of your truth and your story. And we look forward to staying in touch.
It's a pleasure. And I really appreciate this opportunity and the work that you do as well. It's inspiring.
So we're back.
Yes, we
What
are.
did you notice in that dialogue with Ron?
Here's the thing. There's so much we could talk about, obviously. I believe in the concept of EOS, of identifying children who have typically been overlooked and finding ways in a system to support. In terms of his talking about what got overlooked at his school district, I mean, they're ready to go. He believes that they're ready to go. I think I mentioned last week I was reading Colin Powell's book, and he says you got to trust the people in your team. And so he did, right, Ron? He trusted his people and he got there and they're doing their walkthrough and he's with his union rep and they're noticing, oh my God, we're not ready. We can't come back. My heart is in like my throat thinking, what must that have been like to have to then tell your community, yeah, we're not coming back. I imagine in the work that you do with the Equity Collaborative, and particularly when you're working with leaders of color, they have very few opportunities to make what is perceived to be a mistake, even though this could happen to anybody. And so anyway, I had a flood of feelings about that.
What do you think of what he thought he should do differently in the after action review? What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So he talked about individually checking all the events personally. I believe he meant it. And I think in my conversation with him, he's a thoughtful person who probably recognizes they had to build a better system. It can't be one individual and it can't be the superintendent. That's such a burden because what happens now with some other order that you believed was going to come through? Now you're going to check the mailroom every day to make sure that the mail came in, or
What about the new doors on the bus? Do they work?
So I don't believe that. I mean, he said it, so I believe that that's what he would have done in that instance. That's item learning, and I do believe that he is more of a system learner in that he would have to build just a better system.
I wanted to ask him, did you trust the person who was in charge? Do you trust the person who was in charge? I'd be interested to know the answer to that because the action that he's taking indicates less trust, but I don't know whether that trust is missing. Thus, to your point, I don't know whether he's lost trust. I think he just doesn't have a system in place. This is also so challenging. That was a tough one. Like, I'm starting in this new, bigger district because he went to South Orange, right? That was where he went to? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm starting in this new, bigger district, and 6 months later, it's COVID. Oh, that's brutal. That is not easy. That is very, very difficult. It was hard for very well-established and trusted superintendents to navigate COVID, let alone someone they just brought in. Odds are the trust level is going to be really low. And so his ability to indicate to the people that are working with him, I truly do trust you. And if you notice any challenges, please just let me know.
So I kind of think we're coming full circle here because you talk about the amount of time it takes to build trust. And you also started our conversation by talking about how much time it takes to influence change over time. So I want to give you the last word, and then we'll see everybody next week.
I actually have a data point that I think is fascinating, and it probably goes to the idea of students, young people's brains are faster to change than old people's brains. In one of our districts, there is a student leadership model that they're using that is spectacular, and most student leader, I think basically any opportunity that students get to take leadership for a shift that they want to see in their own school. In this case, it's a cultural shift. The idea was everybody belongs. Everybody's going to belong here. I forget what it was, but there was an event where a white student called a black student the N-word, and white students who were near that white student said, hey, we don't do that here. We don't use that language. And that's not okay. So it was white students that did the interruption. Then the black student, who was in the part of the student leadership, initiated a restorative process with the white student that used the word, where the white student said, I didn't realize, I'm truly sorry. And there was a healing process. That black student then went to the principal, who was ready to follow through with the behavioral implications as a result of using a racial slur. And the black student said to the principal, no, the healing process that I ran was helpful. And I feel like that student understands what happened and is truly sorry for their actions. I don't believe any further punishment in this is necessary.
Wow. That is a great,
that was the end. Yeah. And I was like, that's from 2 years worth of working with this student leadership team to specifically address racial slurs in their schools. And the student felt like they could take lead on it.
That is a profound story. That gives me such hope. I mean it. Wow.
It just was like, wow, that's amazing. And some of it's the specialness of that student, some of it's the specialness of the team, and all of that's true.
Gives me hope. You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Jamie, I will see you next week.
I'll see you next week, Peter. Thanks a lot.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be imperfect leaders, so join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast.